ISS, and I'm pleased to be joined by four of my colleagues, in no particular order: Amir Hkayem, Director of Regional Security; Air Marshal Retired Sami Samson, Executive Director of ISS Middle East; Dr. Alexander Bolfras, Head of Strategy, Technology, and Arms Control; and last but not least, Fabian Hinz, Research Fellow for Missile Technologies and UAVs, who has just put out a fantastic piece on our website, IISS.org, on his latest assessment of the limits and effectiveness of Iran's missile strategy. And I'm sure he'll be sharing some of those relevant insights during our conversation now as well. This will be an hour-long conversation, which, as a reminder, is very much on the record. If you have a question, please feel free to insert it into the Q&A function, and we'll make sure to address them as we proceed. Now, before we jump into the assessments of the military campaigns and the more operational dimensions of what we're currently seeing, I'd like to begin by contemplating a little bit how we understand what I think is a seismic shift in the Middle East security order. To my mind, this war, which Israel has started through a surprise attack on Iran on June 13, is the culmination of a paradigm shift that has been in train since at least October 2023. I'll turn to you first, Emil. How should we think about this current moment? Is this another 2003 Iraq War moment, an illegal aggression launched under false pretenses with a view perhaps towards regime change? Or would you characterize it perhaps in different terms? Over to you.
Thank you, Hassan. So all analogies are limited and self-serving, but since many proponents of this war tell us it's 1939 again, I think 2003 is perhaps a bit more appropriate given the context, but there are real differences. Now, from a regional perspective, people are certainly making parallels with 2003. There are big differences. There is no ground invasion in the cards. The goal of regime change is still being debated at very senior levels. One can argue that the broad context of Iran having made threats, very significant ones, and taking action since 1979 means that this is a continuation in a broader conflict rather than a specific, an attack without context. Others would look at that and say, well, the broad context is the war that started since October 2023, with Israel itself being, a very aggressive player, trying to reshape the region, possibly committing ethnic cleansing in Gaza and so on. So that's the context. So the legal arguments will be hashed out, but the perspectives are very divided. Now, in the region, everyone expects exactly what you outlined, Hassan, that this is going to be a major shock to the regional balance of power. There's also a broad expectation that this is about regime change. We'll have to see whether that's exactly what the US and Israel pursue. The differences is that there's a broad understanding that the US and Israel will not own the problem. And that it's going to be pushed on other players, regional and others, to essentially manage the aftermath. But there's also a realization that one of the possible scenarios out there is a repeat of Iraq 91-2003, where you have a strategy of containment, continuous Israeli-US strikes on Iran, a militarized or military regime in Tehran that emerges in possible instability in Iran. But there's another aspect that people are noticing, which is in 2003, France and Germany, among Western powers, opposed the war. Whereas now, reading the G7 statement, there is broad endorsement of the war, not necessarily support, but endorsement. So that's the broad context. Again, all analogies are limited and self-serving, but given some of the parallels that will inevitably be made, I think we need to keep that precedent in mind. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emir. It's interesting. I mean, you brought up the statements by the G7 and the initial French and German reactions that came out, and I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between those positions and the positions we've seen in the region, which have been ones of universal condemnation. You look at the Saudi statement, keeping in mind that 20 years ago, the Saudis themselves were advocating for cutting the head of the snake, and now you actually see a Saudi statement that very clearly, in the strongest terms, condemns Israel's aggression as being blatantly illegal, refers to Iran as a brotherly Islamic nation, and then goes out of its way to make sure, in a gesture of goodwill, that Iranian pilgrims who are still in Saudi Arabia are comfortable and looked after. And so I think it's we've seen a stark shift in approach by the Arab Gulf states towards Iran. And I think the contrast between the European and Gulf reactions has been quite significant. And I think that is interesting for us to look at. Let's jump into into some of the military action here and how we see and assess this. And I might begin with you, Sami. How effective, in your assessment, has Israel's air campaign been so far? I mean, Israel has clearly established almost absolute freedom of action in Iranian skies. What does that mean for Israel's ability to control the tempo of the war? And what does that imply in terms of how this military campaign gets played out?
Thank you, Hassan. Well, I think one characteristic of this air campaign is that Israel focused very specifically on the Iran campaign within the context of a write-down of forces, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. Some time ago. They separated a planning team to conduct planning against Iran some time ago. So very focused. So that the campaign conduct is as much a result of the way it has been planned and resourced as the actual execution itself. Everything was mission rehearsed. This is a deliberate campaign based around preemptive action, controlling the initiative, much different to operations against Hamas or Hezbollah, where they're very much reactive in nature. The battle space was prepared at first back in October with strikes on long-range air defenses and long-range surveillance capabilities. I would also argue that some of the strikes that Israel has taken out in Syria recently are actually linked to blinding, degrading Iran's ability to foresee and counteract and defend against air operations. I think it's markedly different in terms of an air campaign whereby almost the reverse of the campaigns against Hamas and Hezbollah, where this air campaign did not allow the leadership that needed to be targeted to go mobile. They were the very first targets. The pathway was cleared using all of the capabilities and rolling back Iran's defenses gradually so that the access was there. So decapitating and hitting at C2, whilst then sequencing fixed targets that could not go mobile, I think is a great success of this air campaign. The other aspect is the preparedness to config and the configuration for what appears to be the long term. In the first 4 months of the campaign against Hamas, the Israeli Air Force overflew their flying hours and the rate that they could use their airplanes by a factor of 6. A lot of that flying was 10 minutes flying time away. Iran is 2 hours flying time each way, at least, without operating in the area. So I think it's particularly effective in the way that Israel has been able to conduct a campaign at range with efficiency, and that is because of the preparation of the aircraft. We've heard that F-35s have had bespoke modifications. We know that Israel only has somewhere in the region of 7 aged 40-plus-year-old air-to-air refuelers, which have limited capacity. Extended range fuel tanks, etc., on platforms. And then most specifically, the way they're using their weapons is markedly different to other campaigns. And I would say this is a success. When you're conducting a deliberate campaign, choosing the right aeroplane, having the choice of all of your aeroplanes, which Israel has generated. It's generated the space for F-35, F-15, and F-16. And not using a JDAM against a foot soldier, but using a JDAM against a JDAM target is a very effective, efficient way of managing a campaign. Operational weapons have been struck against operational targets. The most critical elements of the fixed targets have been struck first. That leaves them the rest of the target set available and at a fixed tempo to be struck. I think what we have not seen has been used very effectively as well in this air campaign. So the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft, which are clearly have a degree of freedom of access as well, and clearly are able to really refine some of the target choices, target selection, and focus of effort. We cannot see the simulation. Israeli simulation will have taken them through every aspect of this. It's a very efficient way to prepare. What we can't see is the fact that the Israeli Air Force are well trained, they're hard flown, they're battle hardened, and they have bespoke equipment and technologies on their airplanes, which they are intimately familiar with. What we can't see is the amount of electronic warfare, the spoofing, the jamming, the deception, which will be enabling these operations. So the bit that we can see, I think, is very precise targeting. It's being done at a tempo of Israel's choice. They are creating the space and the freedom and the capacity to both hit deliberate targets and fixed targets, but also have the capacity to strike at fielded forces. The fielded forces that matter, the missiles, the ballistic missiles, the launchers, and some of the sites. So if we look at the very first day of operations, 200 plus fighter aircraft. Next day, pause, next day, maybe 100 plus fighter aircraft, according to Israeli statements. Now it is settled into a rhythm, 50, 60, 70 aircraft, 50, 60. That tells me that they are in control, that this is a very well prepared operation. The precision, as yet, broadly speaking, all the targets have been limited to military targets. There has been limited collateral damage, civilian casualties, when compared to the conduct of and the assessments in other theaters, and most importantly, that generating the freedom of action has allowed the political leadership to leverage their activities in the information campaign. Being able to make statements that tomorrow, my airplanes are going to be overhead Tehran. It sends a very, very powerful message. So I think this is sustainable. The way they are, and this campaign is being fought very efficiently. Israel can control consumption, can control weapons, and can control the tempo of their flying. And I think that is a huge advantage and a great success of the design of an air campaign.
Yeah, I mean, you raised the interesting and I think important point that, in a sense, I mean, this has been strategically predictable, meaning that the Israelis have been talking about this for quite some time. President Trump has been clear that if Iran failed to agree to a nuclear deal, that there could be a military response. The regional actors seem to be aware of this. You remember the Saudis dispatched Defense Minister Prince Khalid bin Salman in April to Tehran to deliver a very clear message to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, saying, if you don't sign up to a deal with Trump, there really is this, real chance that that Israel will strike. So in a sense, I mean, the interesting thing here is that Israel was able to create tactical surprise with the timing and the, of this attack, even though there was a high degree of strategic predictability that the attack was coming. Just a quick follow-up question, Sami. And we've seen claims from Iran of having shot down multiple Israeli fighter aircraft. Have you seen any evidence to suggest that this may in fact be the case?
There has been no evidence that that is the case. However, it is Netanyahu did make a statement saying that his hundreds of aircrew going at extreme risk, placing their lives on the line, exposed to Iranian action and risking their lives. And I think perhaps that's where some of these comments come from. If in every other campaign, and particularly an environment like this, a downed aircrew, dead or alive, the wreckage would be paraded and would be used in a counter-information warfare sense. There has been none of that. That is not control and discipline. That to me is clear evidence that it has not been the case. It's an interesting point, though. I mean, the characteristic for this campaign is that this is the one part of the armed conflict that we've seen between Israel and Iran's proxies and Iran itself over the past 2 years that Israel has prepared for. That is very clear. They have prepared very carefully for this. Most commentators would say in some of these sort of campaigns that you'll get 60% serviceability out of your airplanes. The Israeli Air Force is claiming 90% serviceability and availability. Most people would say that you'll be aircrew and engineer limited. You have to close down your flying training system, and it puts a lot of pressure on. Israel has graduated 4 classes of fighter pilots and weapon systems officers, since October the 7th. That's a half a class less than that they would have done outside of conflict. So the preparedness for this type of campaign, it is very clear. I have no doubt that they are equally prepared to recover downed aircrew and deny Iranian access to any downed aircraft. And there's been no evidence that there's been any need for those missions to be operationalized.
Thanks, Sami. Let me turn to you, Fabian, for your assessment of the effectiveness of Iran's use of its strategic arsenal, its missiles, its UAVs. Could you put that into context for us? I mean, how effective have they been this time around? And how does it compare to previous rounds where Iran has mobilized previously its strategic arsenal against Israel? Are there any big surprises that violate some of what we thought we knew about this strategic arsenal? Or is this proceeding in a way that we would have expected prior?
Yeah, most definitely. So I would start with saying that deterrence by punishment has always been the main pillar of Iran's defensive strategy. When it comes to defending the airspace, or you could call it deterrence by denial, that has become more important for Iran in recent years. They have, of course, purchased a few more capable Russian defensive systems that were mostly disabled or entirely disabled during Israel's strike last year. And they've invested quite a lot of money and a lot of effort into the development of locally produced, locally developed indigenous systems. But still, this idea that Iran would strike back heavily and deter any enemy action was always the core pillar. So because of that, it was already expected that Iran would retaliate with medium-range ballistic missile fire. And as Sami has pointed out from the very beginning of the Israeli air campaign, wider than air campaign, ground campaign, you could also say, when you talk about the sabotage long-range weaponry that was used, these systems were targeted. So we saw from the very beginning that Israel used UAVs smuggled into the country to take out air defense systems and ballistic missile launchers as well potentially also used long-range anti-tank guided missiles to do that. And we saw attacks on Iran's major missile bases in the West early on. So usually in times of crisis, the mobile launchers swarm out, they get dispersed. But the missiles still tend to be stored in these underground bases. So that already put quite a bit of strain on the Iranian campaign. Then there was the disruption of C2. You had the commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force, that's basically the force that controls Iran's missile arsenal, being killed, as well as many of his senior advisors. And there were attacks against communication infrastructure as well. And again, as Sami has pointed out, there are probably many unseen aspects in terms of cyber, in terms of EW, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that seems to have had an impact. The initial attack wave, or two successive attack waves on the first day, compromised only around 150 ballistic missiles. That is quite noteworthy because if you look at the attack last October, it was around 200 missiles in 2 consecutive waves. So it stayed below that limit, even though it was actually the response to a much more significant event. And after that, we saw a gradual decline of numbers. Of course, it's going up and down a little, but basically every day we're seeing a few tens or a few dozens of missiles being fired by Iran. I think one thing that is really surprising here is, of course, the initial disruption, but also the Israeli ability to go after the mobile launchers. That is something that's tremendously difficult, especially when you're operating over a country that is pretty large geographically, that is far away, and that is operating disguised launchers. So basically Iranian ballistic missile launchers, most of them can be disguised as regular trucks, and detecting and destroying these, especially shortly before launch, is something that's quite impressive. The Israelis are saying that they're having tremendous success with this mode of operation, destroying potentially up to 40% of the launchers. So again, all of these factors probably contribute to Iran now firing less missiles than we would have originally expected. The big question here, of course, is how many missiles does Iran have left? How many launchers does it have left? That is a closely guarded secret. The Iranians always talked about thousands of missiles. CENTCOM once talked about 3,000 missiles back in 2022, but that would also be shorter range systems. The Israelis said 2,000 medium range ballistic missiles. How many of these are still available? We don't know. But I would say that is basically the big calculation for Iran now, having to estimate how long the war is going to take, how much they still have in their arsenal, how much of that will be destroyed over the coming days and potentially weeks, and then calculating how to fire, how to adjust the fire rate. There's a very interesting interview with Qasem Soleimani about the war 2006 in Lebanon, where he was talking about the very same calculation that Hezbollah had to do, basically saying if we want to emerge victorious, we have to fire missiles until the very last day. Because of that, we need an estimate of how long the war is going to take. So a very difficult calculation. In terms of the effects in Israel, it's interesting to note that the number of casualties, both wounded and killed in Israel, is significantly higher than what we saw in 2024, despite these barrages being pretty large. And I would argue that there are different potential reasons for that. The first is Iranian target selection. So in 2024, they heavily focused on remote military targets. They appear, at least that's what they're saying, they appear to be still striking these targets, but there have also been strikes against targets in urban population centers. Of course, there the chances of hitting something are much larger, even if the accuracy of your missiles is not that great. It wasn't that great back in 2024. Whether that was because of Israeli countermeasures or the limited quality of Iranian missiles, we don't know, potentially both. But now we're seeing these strikes taking place against urban targets as well. There might have been a reallocation of defensive systems on the Israeli side. So basically saying we have a limited amount of interceptors. We need to protect our strategic assets first. So all of these are factors that could have contributed to that rise in casualties. And of course, here the big number, the big question is also what are the numbers of interceptor missiles on the Israeli side? The Israelis are using some systems like David Sling that haven't been used against this class of missile before, so they might have a bit of more arsenal depth, but still the question remains how many interceptors, Arrow 2, Arrow 3, do they have in their arsenal? They're getting support from the US, that has been confirmed. So the US THAAD batteries in Israel are intercepting missiles, US Navy vessels are intercepting missiles, but then again, Navy vessels also have limited arsenal depth. But I would say overall, the situation for the Iranians is not easy. They do not have a lot of options. The one thing I would, however, add to complete this short overview is that these shorter range systems that would be used against US forces or energy infrastructure in the Gulf are very distinct capability from the medium range ballistic missiles. So they use different launchers, they're different missiles, they're also stationed in different bases. So that arsenal still is, we could call it untapped. Of course, there are a few factors that impact the operation of both of these systems. Disruption of C2, for example, is something that would affect both of these capabilities. But still, there is a lot of potential with shorter range ballistic missiles to cause disruption. And they have anti-ship missile capabilities as well that could cause quite a lot of trouble for commercial shipping, but would also be a challenge for the US Navy operating in the region. But then again, do they want to use these systems actively with all geopolitical risk involved? That's an entirely different question. So that's basically my outlook. Finally, I would perhaps say that when you look at the wider Iranian strategy, it's probably already a failure of that strategy when you see these missiles being used. So these medium-range ballistic missile capabilities were always there for deterring an attack against Iran in the first place, particularly against the nuclear program. And the fact that they have to use them already shows that some major pillars of the Iranian defensive strategy have been weakened and are not functioning the way they imagined them to function at the moment.
So here's a follow-up question to you, Fabian, and thank you very much for that extensive overview. I mean, in a sense, there are parallels with some of Israel's previous military operations against Iran's regional partners in the region. Now, and Sami, shed light on some of the distinctions and the differences, for example, with the Israeli playbook on Hezbollah. But there are also parallels in the sense that, you have a clear decapitation strike against the leadership. Back in Lebanon and Iran now, you've clearly seen an Israeli systematic effort to take out launchers, which are essentially choke points for your missile capabilities and so on. Why, and this is a question coming from one of the members of the audience, why does Iran seem to have been so ill-prepared? Could it not see this coming? Was it simply caught off guard by the timing because it had placed a lot of faith in the nuclear talks? So how do you explain what really looks like a lack of ability to prepare?
So I would say Iran did not have a lot of good options. It's interesting because now sometimes you hear the opinion that Iran was too hesitant in replying to Israeli actions in the region. But then I remember when they launched the first large barrage back in April, everyone was surprised by that kind of reaction. People thought, okay, that diplomatic facility in Syria got struck. They're going to do something by Hezbollah. No one expected Iran to launch a major barrage. So they did quite a lot of very aggressive counteraction after the Israelis struck them in Lebanon and Syria. I would say the Iranian strategy had one basic problem, and that was that their capabilities only could do limited damage. So no one ever expected, also not the Iranians, that Iran's or Hezbollah rocket program and the arsenal would be able to really militarily defeat Israel and destroy Israel's military capabilities to the point where Israel has to surrender or is being captured. That was always a ludicrous idea. I think everyone knew that they could only do limited damage, but they trusted that this limited damage, this cost that they could impose on Israel would be enough to deter aggression. And I think for a long time that actually was true. I think the most interesting example in this case is Hezbollah. When you think about the late 2010s, the early 2020s, there were some conflicts between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel issued some threats, but in the end, you had a deterrence relationship, despite minor hiccups, mostly held. And despite no major change in capabilities, it completely collapsed in 2024. So I think the issue here was really that after October 7th, Israel went into a new mode of action, that it was simply willing and that its leadership was willing to take certain measures and was willing to endure the costs. This idea that ballistic missiles landing in the center of Tel Aviv, that won't deter you anymore. Then the whole equation changes. And I think this is something that Iran was not prepared for. And that Iran, basically the whole deterrence equation was built on the idea that you could deter Israel with these relatively limited actions. And once that was not the case anymore, a major foundation for that equation was removed. And I think you can actually see that the Iranian strategy in other areas is still working, or was working until recently. If you look at Houthi attacks against civilian shippings, again, here, very limited costs are enough to deter certain action, like passing through the Red Sea. You don't have to sink every single ship. You don't have to defeat the US Navy. You just have to hit a ship every few days or every few weeks, and it's enough. But against Israel, it just didn't work anymore.
Yeah, and it's clear that Israel's appetite for risk, I think, has changed dramatically over the past 1.5 years, and that in many ways has validated the core tenets of the strategy. That's very interesting. Thanks, Fabian. Now I'll turn to a topic that has been already the subject of multiple questions from our audience members, which is obviously the status of Iran's nuclear program. I'll turn to you, Alex. You've been tracking developments there quite closely. In your assessment, how much damage has Iran's nuclear program sustained so far? And then perhaps looking ahead, I mean, it's difficult to anticipate what the end state of that program will look like on the other end of this war. But under a few scenarios that you think are probable, how quickly would Iran be able to rebuild its nuclear program?
Yeah, thanks. Really good question. So there are, of course, many different aspects to the Iranian nuclear program that have caused international concern for their weapons potential. So I'll talk through each of those dimensions and then share a big picture assessment after. So the real focus of the Israeli campaign has been Iran's uranium enrichment infrastructure, as well as the ability to turn that uranium either into reactor fuel, which is what the Iranians claim it's for, or for nuclear warhead, which is what the Israelis claim it's for. But that's in the early days of the air campaign. Those were the main targets at Natanz, Isfahan, and so forth. But of course, the really big piece remains at Fordo still, and this has been in the headlines quite a bit. It's a deeply buried facility that has a lot of the advanced Iranian enrichment capability there still in place. Another kind of question that relates to the uranium side of things is some of the concerns that have been expressed about the Iranian program has been its large stockpile of highly enriched uranium. That's been enriched up to 60%, which arithmetic aside is really just around the corner from 90%. That's kind of a quirk about how enrichment works. So there's a large stockpile there, enough for a handful of nuclear weapons, theoretically. And it's unclear where this material is at the moment. Israeli intelligence has claimed that they know exactly where it is, but at this point, the International Atomic Energy Agency certainly has lost track of it and has lost visibility into it. So that's kind of a big mystery at the moment. A new dimension opened up overnight. Israel struck at the Arak reactor, which is a nuclear energy producing reactor that has been under construction, so it was not operational. And the concern there is that were the reactor to come online and to produce plutonium, that in the long run that plutonium could also find its use in a nuclear warhead. But it's important to emphasize here that that step requires the separation of plutonium from the spent fuel out of a reactor, which is not something that the Iranians are believed to have. So that was a much longer term nuclear capability that appears to have been damaged. The biggest mystery surrounds the Iranian ability to turn uranium into a nuclear warhead. That's something that has been subject of dispute for a long time. There's an interesting article in The Economist that came out this morning that purports to describe the contents of the Israeli intelligence assessment that has been shared with various Israeli-friendly governments, and that suggests that that there's a new separate effort underway on weaponization, on creating a nuclear warhead capability, and that the people who were involved were those who were involved with the weaponization effort leading up to 2003. And those are the same people who have been targeted for assassination by the Israelis in the opening hours of this conflict. Interestingly, the Israelis also appeared to have taken out some of the documentation, the so-called Iranian Nuclear Archive, of which the Israelis have at least a partial copy. So they're really trying to systematically go through and eliminate the raw materials that would be needed for a nuclear weapon in the form of the uranium infrastructure, the intellectual ability in the form of scientists and engineers, as well as things like test results from previous experiments, things like that, and also focusing on the longer term capability to produce plutonium. But despite these efforts, the Iranian nuclear program has grown quite a bit over the decades. It has existed. It is a pretty sizable and distributed capability. So at the moment, there's nothing that has been destroyed that would make it impossible for the Iranians to reconstitute their enrichment capability beyond what remains at Fordo at the moment. And so there are, of course, timelines being bandied about how many days, weeks, months, or years Iran has been set back. The real question there is what are we measuring that against? What would be the objective for the Iranians to get back to? So under one scenario, if they really wanted to withdraw from the NPT and produce a primitive nuclear device, they could probably do that in a matter of months, pending further Israeli action. If they really tried to build back a large national nuclear program, the way that they've been working on, that ostensibly is for peaceful nuclear energy purposes, that of course would be a matter of months, if not years.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I think this is just very recently apparently there are reports that Israel may have struck at the Bushehr nuclear reactor. It's unclear how much damage it has sustained, but this is obviously something that's of tremendous concern to all of the Arab Gulf states and Iran's neighbors, because contamination from that plant into Gulf waters could mean the contamination of the critical water resource that these countries depend on. It could mean contamination of the air, and obviously this is a scenario that the Gulf states, I think, probably registers at the top of their sort of nightmare emergency scenarios. But thank you very much for that overview, Alex. Sami, Alex mentioned Fordo, which I think is very much the talk of the hour. One question that's on my mind, and that is on the mind of several of our audience members, is: does Israel really need US help to take out Fordo, or would it be able to do so on its own? Could you unpack that for us?
Yeah, thanks, Hassan. I think there are two key indicators which I would use, and data points which I would say that it would indicate that Israel does not have the capability to take out Fordo, and then there's a couple of practical needs. So in the strike against Nasrallah in Beirut, the Israeli Air Force used somewhere between 60 and 80 weapons, to get deep enough under the building, through the building, down to where Nasrallah was. The weapons they used were 2,000-pound class weapons, and they're bunker busters. Very sophisticated. So there is absolutely no doubt that they're modeling. I know, having spoken to them, that they use civil engineers to understand intimately the construction of facilities. Still required multiple strikes, and that's maybe 10-15 meters below. That tells them what they can do with what they have available. The aircrew were very proficient. The planning was absolutely spot on. But that number of weapons to go, potentially, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the distance underground, tells me that, they now understand what would be required with the tools they have available. Of course, what that would also require, if you were to scale that up, would be the fact that an awful lot of airplanes would need to be in this, being in the same place which is predictable for an awful long time. So there's a risk level associated with that. With Nasrallah, that was an operation with surprise. This does not have surprise. And whilst the risk appetite it has changed potentially within the Israeli government, putting that many people over a site with no certainty of an outcome does somewhat elevate the risk levels to a level which potentially are unacceptable. The second thing is that when they did those strikes, there was a lot of analysis, because when you have to put multiple bombs into the same hole, you don't just need the bomb to go bang, you need the components to survive. The deeper you go, the more damage there's likely to be to fuses, etc. The Israelis have been focusing on that. I've spoken to people who are in the Israeli research and development center saying, what can we do to help these bombs survive deeper impacts? They have not cracked the code on that one yet. The second data point that I would put out is Operation Many Ways. So if you remember back in September 2024, the Israeli Shaldag commando unit, special forces, went into an Iranian underground missile factory and complex in Syria. It took 120 commandos, 3 hours of operations to only overcome 30 Syrian guards, to get into an underground facility. So whilst there is talk of commando raids onto facilities, once again, if you look at scaling that up, that to me says that this would be an incredibly high risk mission if you were to do something on the ground. So the question really is, would the US weapons and the 30,000 pound class GBU 57s, would they be able to survive and penetrate the facility? I'm pretty certain people will have good knowledge of that. When you think of Fordo, it started off as an overground facility. We know intimately what the construction is above the facility that is now underground. So the ability to kind of model and to engineer, I think, it is available, will be available to the Israelis. There is absolutely no chance they have the weapons, nor the platforms that could carry heavier class weapons to do this at the moment. The big question is, does the modeling say that the US weapon GBU 57 could do the same thing? My sense is that it would take multiple strikes, and the more strikes you conduct, the less predictable you're into more and more unknown territory. And so the question is for me is if the US could do a strike, if it could be struck, if the Israelis couldn't and somebody else could, you have to understand what effect you want to create, and can you guarantee that effect? Because it would be pretty disastrous from a strategic communications perspective if you put 400 Israeli airplanes over the top of Fordo, or you put the might of the US over the top of Fordo, and it survived. How do you handle that?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that, Sami. So let's zoom out here and look at the sort of the regional and international dimensions of this conflict. Emil, you track Iran's networks of influence very closely. I mean, to what extent have Iran's regional allies, the PMF or PMU, Hezbollah, the Houthis, to what extent have these groups mobilized in favor of Iran? And even if they were to mobilize, are they truly capable of lending meaningful support to Tehran at this juncture?
Thanks, Hassan. I think we need to put the Houthis in a different box altogether, because from their perspective, they have a good thing running. And Fabian, who also tracks this, will be able to tell us if there is a qualitative shift. But in a way, at present, the Houthis are continuing to do what they've done. and I think with an eye on what's happening in the Gulf region. Will Iran now suddenly prioritize the Strait of Hormuz? Is there an ability to obstruct, harass maritime traffic there, impose a cost on the global economy, compel the Gulf states to take one action or another? But let me just turn to first to Hezbollah, which was supposed to be the instrument of deterrence and punishment. Hezbollah was built for a scenario like this one, except that Hezbollah essentially is no longer a strategic actor because of how it was defanged in previous rounds of conflict. It's important to understand that unless there is other evidence, Hezbollah and Iran were surprised by October 7 and were behind the curve all along. Hezbollah in particular, was entangled in a war of ever-increasing intensity of attrition that essentially gave Israel total advantage because it had intelligence dominance, as we saw with the pager attacks and the targeting of Nasrallah and so on, and total air superiority in Lebanon. It's much closer. Lebanon is much closer than Iran, for instance. So the Israelis were. This was a war that Israel knew how to fight and had prepared to fight since 2006. I think the problem for Hezbollah is that it got involved into the wrong kind of war from its perspective. It was struggling with it. It lost its top echelon of military commanders, within a year and a half. And then, 10 days before he was killed, Hassan Nasrallah goes on television and tries to convince people that he knows what Israel's risk appetite is, that Hezbollah is firmly on the escalation ladder, and then bam, 10 days later he's killed, and within a month Hezbollah is essentially defeated as a strategic player. So today the question is, if Hezbollah jumps into the fight, to do what? It is already internally has lost massive credibility. It is significantly struggling on the political level. Most others in Lebanon, including many in its own community, just don't see why. If you're going to fight and you have no prospect of winning, so is that suicide, essentially? So Hezbollah is so far a non-actor. Now, you can see an extreme scenario where Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, is killed, or it's a real decapitation one, and you have real hardliners in Hezbollah who say, well, you know what, we're organically linked to Iran. We're not here to live for the day after. We're here to go up with Iran or go down, and that's the moment. But the question is, which capabilities and what concept? Is it just raining fire on Israel, or is it something else? So Hezbollah is really in a massive bind at present. The PMF in Iraq have been, interestingly, mostly silent, I think, because the Iraqis also, the Iraqi government and others, they just don't want it. This is if Iran looked strong, perhaps, and determined and so on, then perhaps some of its allies would mobilize. But now that Iran looks very weak and not being on top of things, essentially, if you are in Iraq, so what's the point? To shoot at American bases? Perhaps there'll be some of that, but it won't be a strategic effort. It won't be an effort that distracts from the main event. So it is a failure in a way of Iran's deterrent strategy. Alongside the one that Fabian discussed on the missile side. It was simply not supposed to be that way because Iran and its allies had prepared for a very different kind of war, except that you never fight the war you want to fight. You fight the war that's just in front of you.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the Houthis as being in somewhat of a different category of their own. And the Houthis have been interesting here. I mean, Netanyahu claimed that the reason why he entered this conflict was because they had intelligence that Iran was about to provide the Houthis with nuclear weapons or capabilities. Now, Alexander, I mean, how theoretically feasible would a transfer of Iranian nuclear weapons or capabilities be to a group like the Houthis?
That's also a really good question. I don't see any real factual basis for the claim that the Iranians would be preparing something like that. I mentioned some of the readouts we've been getting on the intelligence assessment that the Israelis have been sharing with other governments, and nothing in there is reported to suggest anything to do with transferring any nuclear weapons or components to the Houthis. And I would just point out that it wouldn't make a lot of sense for the Iranians to go through decades of trouble to pursue nuclear capabilities and then hand over control over that to another actor. So I don't think there's much to the story.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Then, Fabian, I mean, on a more sort of realistic note, the Houthis did claim that they have launched coordinated missile strikes with the IRGC against Israel. Do you see real indications of coordination? And then, does that make a substantive difference one way or another?
So I think it's quite realistic to see and expect further coordination. We already saw a bit of that last year when the Houthis also fired a few missiles or UAVs as part of the two major Iranian attack waves against Israel in April and October. And I would say the Houthis' advantage is at the same time the Houthis' disadvantage, and that is just geography. They're very far away from Israel. They're basically almost as far away as Iran. And that has a few advantages. Yemen used to be the periphery of the so-called axis of resistance, so intelligence penetration is almost certainly far lower than in Lebanon or in Iran. That makes it more difficult to target the Houthis. The Houthis still have launchers to launch, for example, liquid-propellant ballistic missiles. How many do they have? We don't know, but these are complex systems that you could take out if you had the intelligence. And distance is a challenge that can be overcome, as we're seeing right now in Iran. But I guess intelligence capabilities in Yemen are just not that great. It's not the enemy Israel prepared for years. So that shields them to some extent. But on the other hand, of course, missile and UAV capabilities, especially missile capabilities, get more complicated, more expensive, and as a result, fewer in numbers, the longer the ranges you need to bridge. And that was exactly what Hezbollah's advantage was. There's this great quote by the founder of Iran's missile program, Hassan Tehrani Moghadam, who went to southern Lebanon, and he said, "Why are we even building medium-range ballistic missiles to hit Israel from Iran? They're so expensive. We could just build cheap 150-kilometer rockets, which don't even need guidance, and we can fire them from southern Lebanon into Tel Aviv." So I think this was always the strategic calculus, saying we have this ally that is very, very close to our arch enemy, and because of that, that ally can use incredibly cheap systems. And because these systems are cheap and simple, that ally can build up a tremendous arsenal when it comes to numbers. I mean, if you just talk about numbers, of course, these systems are different in capability. With Iranian ballistic missiles, people are arguing whether it's 2,000, 3,000, perhaps a little less. With Hezbollah, people were talking about 100,000 rockets, 200,000 rockets. And of course, these would be shorter range with lighter warheads, but still it's a different number altogether. And the fact that, as Emil has pointed out, that capability has been defanged makes it really difficult to replace it. And with Houthis, I think the Houthis' strategic communications have been excellent. They had quite a lot of luck in terms of overcoming Israeli defenses. That is also true. But it is the thing that is going to deter the Israelis or impose unacceptable costs to the Israelis. That's something I just don't see. And I don't see the potential for building a Houthi capability to an extent that would actually make that possible. Because then in the end, whether you ship the missile to Yemen or you fire it from Iran, yeah, having different attack vectors is nice, but it's not a significant difference, I would say.
So here's a question from our audience for whoever would take it. I mean, is there anything that the Russians and the Chinese could do for Iran at this stage, be it diplomatically or militarily? Have we seen indications that either of them have tried to resupply Iran in any way? And diplomatically, we've seen quite a bit of activity from President Vladimir Putin over the past 48 hours. But do you think that there's anything really the Russians or Chinese could do at this stage for Iran?
Well, let me take a stab at that. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine again, the Iranians hoped that that would be the beginning of some big strategic partnership with Russia and China, particularly Russia. And we saw defense cooperation with Iran providing UAV technology and UAVs simply to Iran, which to some extent explains why Europe this time was much more critical of Iran. I mean, that's one of many reasons, but it's very clear that the Russians don't have the capability or the desire to expose themselves further. In Iran, China is watching from far, I think, with some concern, but mostly with some glee that the US is yet again completely bogged down in the Middle East with massive financial, military, reputational costs and so on. So no one seems to be coming to Iran's rescue. The question is, would Iran at one point try to corral them as part of a diplomatic strategy, emphasizing the role of the UN Security Council and so on? But Trump and Israel are unlikely to really use those kind of intermediaries. They may not even care about either Gulf partners or the Europeans, for that matter. There were rumors that the EU foreign ministers and the Iranian foreign minister would meet tomorrow about that. All this is perhaps for some de-escalation, but it's not going to be the big deal. So if you're sitting in Iran, you don't have that many friends who matter at the moment. Actually, let me requalify this: you have zero friends that really matter at this point. So they're very much in a difficult position, and this axis was overhyped. From a strategic, political, and operational perspective, and now we see, the damage that some of these illusions create.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Emil. I mean, I think one final point that's worth mentioning is this: the potential landing points, the end points, the end state. Where are we likely to end up once the most intense phase of the conflict ends? And I think the possibility of regime change is on the minds of many people, partly because the Israelis have been talking about eliminating the supreme leader, and Trump has not ruled that out. I think if I had to speculate about how Iran's neighbors would view this possibility, I mean, the only scenario in which this potentially could be a net positive for the region is if we see the Iranian state survive, but with a regime that is moderate and more peaceful and in sync with its neighbors. Now, in my sort of layman's opinion, I think that possibility does not look very elevated. I think the real possible scenarios that we're looking at is if in case we were to see regime collapse, a more militant, radical alternative could take its place. I mean, the IRGC is the most organized and potent force in the country. And then there's no telling how much value those elements and that successor would place, say, for example, on the improvement in diplomatic relations that Iran and its Arab Gulf neighbors have achieved in recent years. There's also the equally worrying possibility of fracture and chaos within Iran. And I don't suspect that Iran's neighbors would want to see a failed state on their eastern flank with loss of central state control over considerable stockpiles of UAVs, missiles, and nuclear and other components stockpiles. So I think it's, to my mind, but that could be my pessimistic bias, a very bleak situation ahead, pretty much however this is likely to end. This is all we have time for. Thank you very much for joining us throughout this 1 hour discussion. Thank you to our panelists for their time and for contributing their thoughts. Stay tuned. We have a number of pieces and further analysis coming your way as we continue to monitor this situation. Take care and see you again very soon. Thank you.